A shy kid finally opens his mouth, climbs onto a wooden desk, and an entire classroom of teenage boys follows him up there in protest of a firing they can't stop. That single image has been quoted, spoofed, parroted on network television, and cried over for 35 years, and it belongs to Dead Poets Society, the 1989 Touchstone Pictures drama that quietly turned Robin Williams into a serious dramatic actor almost by accident. Peter Weir directed it. Tom Schulman wrote it, drawing heavily on his own teenage years at a conservative Nashville prep school. Robin Williams played John Keating, the unconventional English teacher who tells his students to rip pages out of their textbooks and calls himself Captain, my Captain. Ethan Hawke, Robert Sean Leonard, and Josh Charles were the unknown teenage actors whose careers were essentially launched by it, while Kurtwood Smith and Norman Lloyd played the two adults standing squarely in Keating's way. The film's premise sounds almost deceptively simple on paper. An elite, all-boys boarding school in 1959 Vermont, a handful of privileged teenagers under enormous pressure from their fathers, and one teacher who tells them to look at the world differently before it's too late. It shouldn't have worked as well as it did. There's no explosion, no villain twirling a mustache, nothing resembling a conventional plot engine, just conversations, poetry, and consequences. And yet it became one of the defining coming-of-age films of its decade, launched at least 3 major acting careers, and still gets quoted by people who've never sat through an entire English class in their lives. But behind the finished film sits a pile of stories almost nobody talks about. A burned Hollywood set, an entire state economy paid partly in $2 bills, an actor who quietly rewrote his own villain's arc, and a real-life teacher who mostly just did it all to entertain himself. Here are 15 things you probably didn't know about Dead Poets Society. And stick around for number 1, because the movie's most devastating shock came from an actor's own gut instinct, not from anything written in the script. Tom Schulman wrote the original spec script back in 1985, and by his own account it sat unsold for roughly 2 years before Disney finally bought it in 1987. What the studio actually bought, though, isn't quite what audiences eventually saw on screen. According to Schulman's own recollection at a 2014 Austin Film Festival panel, Disney's earliest notes on the project wanted the poetry stripped out entirely and replaced with dancing, apparently trying to get ahead of the year's brief swing music revival. They'd even settled on a new title before a single scene was shot, Sultans of Swing. The plan was to rebuild the entire story around Keating as the flashy lead, rather than around the students discovering him, essentially turning the whole project into a teacher-led dance picture with a boarding school backdrop. Schulman has said he was thrown into something close to a panic when those notes landed on his desk. Producer Jeffrey Katzenberg ultimately overruled his own development executives and stuck with the poetry as written. Somewhere in a Disney file cabinet, there may still be a folder for a musical about swing dancing at an all-boys school. Nobody in that version ever got around to seizing the day. It's worth remembering that this wasn't Schulman's first attempt at a screenplay, either. Reporting from Mental Floss notes, he had already written and shelved 4 earlier scripts before this one finally sold, meaning the writer nearly abandoned poetry as a subject entirely on a project that hadn't even sold yet. Long before Disney ever agreed to buy the script, it had already made the rounds and been turned down everywhere. According to the AFI catalog's official production notes, producer Stephen Haft first came across the screenplay only after it had already been rejected by every studio, including Disney, and he initially read it purely as a writing sample rather than a real prospect. He liked it enough to option it himself for a modest sum and started quietly circulating it among actors and directors on his own initiative, well outside the usual studio system. Haft's real advantage in getting it made wasn't industry muscle. It was a personal connection from his own school days. He had attended prep school alongside Jeffrey Katzenberg, who by the mid-1980s was running Disney's more adult-skewing Touchstone label. Haft slid the script back onto Katzenberg's desk even after an earlier pass, and this time it sold within a single day. A title that sounded like poison on a movie marquee. 3 grim boarding school words with dead sitting right up front. Ended up getting produced largely because one persistent producer happened to know exactly the right classmate to call. Before Peter Weir ever touched this project, it nearly belonged to someone else entirely, and the road to his involvement was genuinely chaotic. Revenge of the Nerds director Jeff Canoe was attached first, and he wanted Liam Neeson cast as Keating. Disney, meanwhile, wanted Robin Williams, who was riding high off his Oscar-nominated dramatic turn in Good Morning, Vietnam. Williams, according to a 2013 University interview with Shulman, wouldn't outright refuse the role, but he also refused to commit to working under Canoe specifically. Disney pushed ahead into pre-production anyway, building full sets outside Atlanta and locking in a shooting schedule, and Williams simply never showed up on the scheduled first day. Disney canceled the entire production and burned the standing sets to the ground, with Shulman later claiming the dailies from that day actually include footage of the fire itself. Dustin Hoffman briefly signed on afterward to both direct the picture and star as Keating, but a dispute over the start date killed that version too. The project only came back to life when Katzenberg personally handed the script to Weir, who reportedly read it during a flight to Sydney and came back already committed to the part. 6 weeks later, he was in Los Angeles casting the film that actually got made. It's a genuinely strange footnote in the film's history that two of the era's biggest dramatic actors, Mel Gibson and Dustin Hoffman, both circled this role at different points before it landed with Williams, a comedian best known at the time for stand-up specials and a hit sitcom about an alien. Weir's willingness to bet on Williams, right after watching an entire production collapse and burn over the exact same casting question, ended up being the decision that made the film work at all. The Keating that audiences eventually met on screen is deliberately something of a mystery. The film never explains why he teaches the way he does, or what shaped his philosophy. That wasn't always the plan. In Shulman's original screenplay, Keating was slowly dying of Hodgkin's lymphoma, with an entire scene showing him bedridden in a hospital, meant to directly justify his whole seize-the-day worldview to the audience. Multiple retrospectives on the production, including pieces published by Collider and various film history archives, describe Peter Weir flatly refusing to direct the picture unless that plotline was removed entirely. His reasoning, by most accounts, was straightforward. Keep the illness in, and audiences leave the theater thinking about a dying man, rather than about the ideas he actually passed on to his students. Shulman reportedly pushed back hard on the cut, but ultimately lost the argument. The finished film never explains Keating at all. No backstory, no medical diagnosis, no built-in excuse. His philosophy simply has to stand entirely on its own, exactly the way the boys' final tribute to him has to stand on its own too. Keating is frequently described as a composite of two very real people from Shulman's own adolescence. Theater teacher Harold Clurman is generally credited with supplying Keating's big, rousing inspirational speeches, while a Nashville high school English teacher named Samuel Pickering supplied the character's theatrical, unconventional classroom stunts. Pickering, who went on to spend decades as a professor at the University of Connecticut and published dozens of essay collections, has written that he sometimes taught lessons while literally standing on top of a classroom desk, or occasionally while sitting inside a classroom trash can. His own explanation for the antics, recorded across various interviews and essay collections over the years, wasn't rooted in some grand educational philosophy about awakening young minds, by his own telling. He mostly did it to entertain himself, rather than to inspire anyone in particular. Pickering taught Shulman for a single school year, 1965 to 1966, before leaving Montgomery Bell Academy for graduate school, with absolutely no idea that his classroom habits would eventually become the blueprint for one of American cinema's most beloved fictional teachers. Pickering has since spoken publicly, in interviews with outlets like NPR's affiliate program network, about only recognizing scattered fragments of himself in Williams's performance rather than a full portrait. A reminder that based on a real person, in Hollywood almost always means something looser and more scattered than audiences tend to assume. Early in filming, Robin Williams sticking rigidly to the page, as written simply wasn't working, by several accounts. His performance came across as stiff and overly careful. So, according to interviews Weir gave to outlets including Script Mag and Slash Film, he quietly scheduled an unofficial half-day shoot and deliberately kept it hidden from Disney's front office entirely. 3 cameras were positioned around the corners of the classroom, and the only real instruction given to Williams was to teach the assembled students whatever he personally wanted, while staying in character as Keating and staying anchored to 1959. Williams launched into dead-on impressions of John Wayne and Marlon Brando reciting Shakespeare, while the young cast, under strict orders to react like genuine students and not like a comedy club audience, tried hard not to visibly break. That officially unscheduled footage became Keating's real first classroom scene in the finished film. Producers later estimated that roughly 15% of Williams's total dialogue across the movie ended up being improvised in some fashion, but this particular sequence is widely considered the one that finally unlocked his whole performance. One of the film's warmest, funniest beats, Todd unwrapping the exact same birthday desk, set 2 years running, then hurling it off a rooftop together with Neil, was not originally written that way at all. As several detailed retrospectives on the production describe it, the scripted version of the scene had Todd instead delivering a much heavier monologue about his father's coldly dismissive opinion of him. Neither Weir nor Shulman felt that version was actually landing the way it was supposed to on set. Ethan Hawke and Robert Sean Leonard reportedly pitched their own alternative to Weir just a day or two before the scene was scheduled to shoot. Skip the confession entirely, and just launched the leather desk set straight off the roof instead. Weir shot the scene exactly as the two young actors had pitched it to him. None of it came from Shulman's original script whatsoever. One of the movie's most human and unexpectedly funny moments exists purely because two barely 20-year-old actors quietly rewrote a scene that wasn't working, entirely on their own initiative, and then convinced their director to trust them. Although Welton Academy is supposedly located in Vermont within the story itself, the film was actually shot at St. Andrew's School in Middletown, Delaware, over roughly 10 weeks spanning late 1988 into early 1989. Coverage from outlets including Looper and various Delaware-focused publications reports that the production brought in more than 1,000 local residents to work as extras, actors, and crew members, injecting an estimated $8 million into the state's economy during that stretch alone. Part of the crew's pay was deliberately issued in $2 bills, a deliberately uncommon denomination chosen specifically so locals would notice that money circulating visibly through shops, restaurants, and tip jars around the state, tying the production's spending directly back to their own communities in a way that was impossible to miss. Decades later, it's entirely plausible that a handful of those bills are still sitting forgotten in drawers somewhere across Delaware, a strange little souvenir left behind by a movie technically set in a completely different, fictional New England town. The scene in which Todd first learns that Neil has died was originally scripted to unfold quietly indoors, inside a dormitory bathroom, entirely alone. Then an actual blizzard hit St. Andrew's School on the very morning the scene was scheduled to be filmed. Accounts collected on trivia sites like TV Tropes, along with cast interviews given over the years, describe Weir scrapping the planned interior setup on the spot, sending Ethan Hawke running directly outside into the falling snow still dressed in his pajamas, with the rest of the young cast following close behind him. The whole sequence was reportedly captured in a single take, largely out of necessity, since nobody on set had any real way of knowing how long the snowfall itself would actually cooperate with the crew. What had originally been written as one boy's private, solitary moment of grief became, purely because of the weather that morning, a scene where the entire group of friends ends up standing together in the snow, sharing that grief collectively. Nothing about that particular shot was planned, blocked, or storyboarded in advance. And the original ending is scripted. Every single surviving member of the Dead Poets Society, including Richard Cameron, the boy who sold out the entire group to save his own skin, was meant to stand on his desk in tribute to Keating, no exceptions. Dylan Cussman, who played Cameron, personally disagreed with that choice. According to interviews referenced by outlets like Den of Geek and several film trivia archives, Cussman raised the objection directly with Weir. Having Cameron suddenly stand up in defiance would contradict everything the character had shown about himself across the entire rest of the film. By his own account, Cussman genuinely didn't expect Weir to actually change a finished ending over his objection, but Weir agreed with him almost immediately. In the finished movie, Cameron remains seated while his former friends rise up defiantly around him, visibly surprised by their loyalty rather than joining in it. That quiet, entirely unscripted contrast ended up making the finale land even harder, largely because one actor understood his own character's psychology more precisely than the page ever did. Despite earning nominations for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor, Tom Schulman's original screenplay ended up as the film's only actual Academy Award win that year. Audience reaction, by sharp contrast, was overwhelmingly enthusiastic from the very start. The film eventually grossed roughly $236 million worldwide against a production budget of around $16 million, according to figures compiled through Wikipedia and various box office reference databases. Critics, however, were split hard right down the middle. Roger Ebert famously gave the film only 2 stars out of 4, opening his published review by dismissing it as a collection of pious platitudes, and later writing that watching the students climb onto their desks in tribute left him, in his own words, so moved that he wanted to throw up. Plenty of other critics were considerably kinder, and the American Film Institute has since recognized the movie on multiple lists, ranking the most inspiring and quotable American films ever made. Few movies manage to be this consistently beloved by everyday audiences, while simultaneously serving as a punching bag for some of the era's most influential film critics. Part of that critical resistance seems tied to timing. 1989 was also the year of Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, and several prominent critics openly argued afterward that the wrong film had ended up in the Best Picture lineup that season. Whatever the critical consensus actually was, it clearly didn't matter much to ticket buyers, who kept the film in theaters for months. Norman Lloyd, who played the stern, unbending headmaster Nolan, was already 74 years old during filming, and he was sitting on one of the strangest and longest resumes in all of Hollywood history. He had been a founding member of Orson Welles' Mercury Theater troupe, appearing in its landmark 1937 modern dress stage production of Julius Caesar. He'd followed Welles out to Hollywood for an earlier, ultimately abandoned project, and according to obituaries published by outlets including Deadline and the Associated Press, he narrowly missed being part of Citizen Kane, simply because he'd already returned to New York theater work by the time that particular production finally came together. Alfred Hitchcock later gave him his breakout film role as the saboteur who plunges from the Statue of Liberty, and reportedly stood by him personally during Hollywood's blacklist era, when other studios were unwilling to. Lloyd also co-starred alongside Charlie Chaplin in Limelight, and remained genuinely close friends with him for years afterward. By the time he turned up on screen as Nolan in 1989, Lloyd had already logged more than half a century working steadily in the entertainment business, and remarkably, he kept right on working until his death in 2021 at age 106, appearing in projects as recent as Judd Apatow's comedy Trainwreck. Los Angeles officially declared a Norman Lloyd Day in his honor around his 100th birthday, and by most accounts, he never really slowed down socially either, reportedly still playing tennis into his 90s and remaining close with the rotating circle of collaborators that spanned from Golden Age Hollywood legends all the way to modern comedy filmmakers. Considering he survived a Hollywood blacklist that ended other actors' careers permanently, playing a rigid, rule-obsessed headmaster in this particular film carries a fairly ironic edge in hindsight. N.H. Kleinbaum's novelization of Dead Poets Society, published the very same year as the film itself, later ended up on the American Library Association's official list of challenged books during the 2015 to 2016 school year. According to records maintained by university library archives that specifically track banned book history in the United States, the book was formally challenged within a school district in Jerseyville, Illinois, after a local pastor complained that it encouraged disrespect toward parents and teachers and actively promoted rebellion against legitimate authority. The district reviewed the complaint through its official process and ultimately chose to keep the book on its shelves. There's a strange bit of symmetry buried in that whole episode. A story fundamentally about a teacher who tells his students to think independently and to question the adults around them, ended up getting formally challenged decades later by someone who apparently understood that exact message a little too clearly for comfort. Book challenges like this one rarely make headlines outside library and education circles, but they're tracked closely by organizations like the American Library Association precisely because the pattern tends to repeat. Stories that celebrate independent thinking are disproportionately likely to draw formal objections from adults uneasy about exactly that message reaching teenagers. 27 years after the film's original theatrical release, Saturday Night Live aired a pre-taped sketch titled Farewell, Mr. Bunting during its season 41 finale, hosted by former cast member Fred Armisen. The sketch, according to coverage from The Hollywood Reporter and the show's own dedicated fan wiki, plays out as a nearly shot-for-shot recreation of Keating's tearful classroom send-off, complete with deliberately stiff, faithful dialogue, right up until one of the students finally stands on his desk and is instantly, graphically decapitated by the classroom's spinning ceiling fan. Blood sprays violently across the room in the aftermath, and Armisen's character, completely unbothered by the sudden carnage unfolding around him, simply finishes packing up his box and strolls calmly out with a cheerful goodbye to his students. Fans and television critics alike have repeatedly called it one of the show's best sketches in years, largely because it spends almost